Hi, everyone. Welcome. Today, we are going to talk about existentialism, specifically at the intersection of religion, psychology, and modern literature. And so, to help elaborate on that topic, we have Professor Sam Mickey with us today. So, Sam is a professor in both the theology and religious studies department, as well as the environmental studies department at the University of San Francisco. And so he often teaches environmental ethics and religion and the environment. And a few years ago, he published a book about existentialism called Co-existentialism and the Unbearable Intimacy of Ecological Emergency. I love that title. It's super relevant to what's going on right now. So before we dive into the topic itself, I'm wondering if you could speak on how you specifically came to existentialism. So welcome. Thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate it. So
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. I'm always happy to chat about existentialism. How I got into it, I've been into it for a pretty long time. Um, I guess probably around like my early teens or something, like maybe 14, 15 years old. I had a friend who was really into it, and I don't know why. Occasionally, you just have some people who like in high school get into like reading philosophy and like smart books and things.
right.
So that was the case with this guy, and it just seemed like um, a way to really understand what it felt like to be alive at that moment. Because I don't know, when you're like 15 is when you start to really think for yourself and question who are you and who do you want to listen to in your life? Like, what kind of authorities do you want to listen to? And maybe I should be a little less attached to like social norms or educational authorities or religious authorities and start really like thinking for myself. Just that basic thing, right? At some point, you start to think for yourself, and existentialism feels like the movement that's on your team when you're doing that, right? So
Nice.
if you feel alienated from normal society and you're trying to go your own way, then that was fun. And so specifically, it was like Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, like those kind of 19th century existentialists, probably Friedrich Nietzsche more than anything. I was reading for some reason in high school. And then later in college, had a professor that said, oh, yeah, everybody goes through like a Nietzsche phase in high school or something.
I
And
didn't.
yeah, I don't think it's that common. This was a European professor. It might be a little more common. There's a
Fair.
little more of a focus on literary education, like in like primary education. When you're young, you're still going to read like the classics. That's not so emphasized in United States education.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, absolutely. A little less of a go your own way kind of get into Nietzsche at an early age. So yeah, you mentioned a little bit about religion. Can you say a little bit more about how existentialism relates to religion? If it emerged from religion, or has it talked about religion?
Yeah, right. So yeah, I guess like technically, existentialism would be defined as a literary and philosophical movement of like the mid to late 19th century through like early to mid 20th century, something like that. And so, as having to do with art and philosophy, religion's really closely associated with that. So the people who really started, who were considered kind of founders of existentialism, if that really even makes sense when talking about existentialism, but like Soren Kierkegaard is a good example. He was all about affirming his existence. He's considered like the father of existentialism, and he was mostly trying to be a good Christian. But he was trying to be a good Christian when Christianity was really dominated by what the church thought about Christianity. And I don't know, I think a lot of people have this feeling like going to church is boring, whereas having an authentic religious experience is actually very passionate and lively, and it touches something very deep in your soul. And so Kierkegaard was one of those people who was living at a time when church wasn't providing that. Like, it was like if you wanted to find Jesus Christ in your life, the last place you would want to go is the official institutions of the church. So, which he called Christendom, like the kingdom of Christianity, like imperial Christianity, right? Christianity is this powerful force. Like, that's not the message. If you read the Gospels at all, Jesus isn't all about power, he's all about weakness and vulnerability and poverty. So it's not about power. And so once Christianity gets a lot of power and the church has a lot of political authority and it has control over people's lives, like then it's lost its way so much. So in a way, what you see somebody like Kierkegaard doing is trying to recover an authentic experience of faith, trying to rescue it from the church that's kind of co-opted it. And so for him, faith was ultimately irrational. He's like, there's no reason. There's no reason to believe. You have to give up reasons. You have to give up everything about yourself. And you make this kind of leap into a relationship to whatever you consider divine, right? A relationship to the absolute. So that phrase, leap of faith, a very common phrase, I think a very popular saying, actually comes from Kierkegaard. He's the leap of faith guy. So that really gives you a sense of what religion meant for existentialists. It's this kind of leap of faith into authenticity where you have no reason to do it, you have no institutional support. It's just about you really saying yes to your life and saying yes to your relationship to whatever is absolute, right, or infinite.
Nice.
So the kind of absolute relationship to the absolute.
So a couple of threads here. Maybe you can take one of them and move. So there's kind of two characters here, Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, who had a very different approach to Christianity. So maybe you could speak about that. But then also you started talking about the church as the colonial force as opposed to the sort of experience, right? And so you have a character like Rudolf Otto, who's not an existentialist, but he kind of disregarded reason and said, no, religion is your experience. So those are kind of two threads I'm thinking. You can pick one of those up and speak on
Yeah,
that.
well, I will say that when like Rudolf Otto is defining the experience of the holy as an experience of that which is wholly other, totally other, that he is getting that largely from the theological tradition he inherited from the 19th century. So Kierkegaard is definitely in the mix, as well as a variety of other people. There's like Friedrich Schleiermacher, there's Hegel, there's a lot of like German theologians leading up to Otto, right? And so Kierkegaard's part of that, Danish, but he was well read among German folks at the time. So that's exactly what's going on, trying to disentangle the institutional side of religion from the experiential side. And that is something Nietzsche was trying to do as well, although ultimately he was mad at the institutional side of Christianity and the experiential side. He found that a lot of Christianity was very negative toward the body, right? It's all about saving your soul. And, obviously you can find all kinds of exceptions if you look at the history of Christianity, of some Christians who are very affirmative of the body or of nature. You know, people like St. Francis of Assisi praying to birds and stuff like that. But by and large, there's a lot of negative attitudes toward the body, toward life, toward like being an animal,
Mm,
right? So being a human, we're technically animals, but we like to pretend, no, we're not animals. We're more spiritual than animal, right? We belong in
right.
heaven. We belong in earth. We're in the world, but we're not of it. And so Nietzsche found all that to just be like anti-life. He's like, this is just a resentment against life. It's like people hate living because living is tough. It stinks. You die in the end. Like there's all kinds of bad things about it. So there's all kinds of things to be like scared of. And then we cling to religion as a way to like avoid life.
Mm,
Like religion becomes an escape mechanism. And so he's like, well, if that's the case, then you can consider me antichrist. If
mm,
there's an antichrist, I'm the antichrist.
mm,
Antichrist here meaning somebody who doesn't hate like the life of faith, but they want to return faith back to the earth, back to our bodies, and back to our connections to animals, our instinct, our will, the power of our body, our capacity for acting in the world. And so you should like feel stronger and more passionate and more excited because religion's in your life, right? And if Christianity doesn't do that, we need to kind of invent a new way. So in a sense, Nietzsche's trying to carve out this new way to live now that the old way is just garbage, right? So when Nietzsche says that God is dead,
right.
which is one of his most famous sayings, he's not just saying that the institutions have lost connection with God. He's saying the very idea of God has become obsolete. And if it ever helped us, it's not helping us anymore. That idea has run its course, and it's time for us to find something new. And that doesn't mean finding like yourself. You get this from, some interpreters of Nietzsche in the psychological tradition, like
Right.
Jung, for instance, see the death of God as the birth of a self.
The self,
Nietzsche's not
exactly.
really saying that. For Nietzsche, the death of God is the birth of a totally new relationship to the earth. And so it's actually more of an ecological sensibility. It's more about animality, your material dimension of life. So it's not just like now we all get to be individual selves.
Right.
Now we have to figure out a way to find meaning without any overarching category.
Right.
What
So
is it?
finding, I was just
Yeah,
gonna say, so like find, because Nietzsche was all about the will, and so like finding the will is more related to like the will in wilderness rather than the will to be a free self, because a free self can be co-opted by, individualism or consumerism, things like that.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, and it's kind of like if you're really just trying to activate your will and affirm it as it exists with your body, with your material energy, then you want to just keep flying and you don't perch.
Mm,
And that's the kind of idea is just pure freedom means you're not perching on anything. God, self, nation. Nietzsche's sister, Elizabeth Forster Nietzsche, was like a big supporter of fascism in Germany and tried to make it seem like her brother was supporting that. So there was this idea in the early 20th century that Nietzsche's like a fascist or something, or somehow he was supporting the kind of anti Semitism that emerged with Nazism
mm,
decades later. And that's not the case at all, but it's easy to take snippets of what he's saying and make it seem like he loved the nation.
right.
So some people say, no, no, really, he loved the self. No, he loved the nation. No, all those when God's dead, the self is dead too, the nation is dead, all the old ways of thinking are gone. And now we need to learn to fly without perching on those kinds of categories. And
Right.
the only way to do that is to really affirm the energies of your body as they exist here on Earth.
Right. So like in the present moment, not resting on, would he say that ideologies are all with the death of God is the death of ideology, or is that something, am I
Sure,
completely
yeah,
in
you
left
could say
field?
that. Yeah, the death of belief systems, that belief systems are no longer really believable anymore. And then his point wouldn't be, therefore, we should have no beliefs.
Mm,
We need to find a new way to believe.
mm,
And so we need to find a deeper faith, a faith that isn't trying to escape from life, a faith that isn't trying to perch, but a faith that wants to fly, right? A
mm.
faith that wants to fly freely and to express the fullness of our animal bodies, the fullness of our material energy.
I can't help but hear a bird in the background. Well, now it went quiet, of course, when you draw it forward. But yeah, there was a bird when you're talking about flying freely. So yeah, you mentioned a little bit about Carl Jung. So maybe we can move into the psychological, how existentialism connects to psychology. So you mentioned Carl Jung, and something you were talking about reminded me a lot of Freud, because you're saying, the death of God, the death of ideology, uh, being in the present moment and not perching or resting on some belief system, which teaches you how to live your life. It's being present in the here and now. And so you were talking about saying yes to your animal self. And so, with Freud, he kind of destabilized the sense of self, because he showed that animal instincts are still a part of us and that we can't dominate them or colonize them with our egos, right? Similar with like Darwin, they both were characters that did scientific research to connect us with our human or with our animal bodies. So I guess Darwin is not a psychologist, but definitely Freud. So if you could say a little bit about how existentialism connects to psychology, that would be awesome.
Yeah. Well, Nietzsche considers himself a psychologist more than a philosopher, because
Oh,
philosophy is, people sitting around pontificating about the ultimate nature of reality. And that mostly is people who are really detached from their own experience. They're relatively detached from their body, right? Philosophers are kind of known to be, people who are just sitting around contemplating rather than walking and moving and engaging the material world, right? So he's like, no, I'm not a philosopher. I'm more of a psychologist because I want to understand human mind, human experience, consciousness,
Mm.
and to bring that consciousness back into its full ground in connection to will, instinct. So in that sense, it is very similar to Freud to kind of say, look, I want to do psychology, but psychology is not just about the ego. There's a lot of deeper stuff happening, and that most of who we are is unconscious. And if you look at what the unconscious is, it's a lot of bodily energy, things like instinct and will, right? So much so that when Freud was developing his theories, people recommended he read Nietzsche, and he was like, "No, because it'll mess me up. I'm like working on a thing." And they're like, "He's so similar. It's so similar." And he's like, "Yeah, well, then that's really going to mess me up. If it's that similar, it's going to make me want to adjust accordingly." And so Freud didn't
Huh.
and put it off until later. And for that matter, Nietzsche knew people that knew Freud, right? Freud is like next generation after Nietzsche died.
Really?
And so, for instance, there was a woman in Nietzsche's life that was sort of a love interest, but like they never got together, but they hung out a lot. And her name is Lou Solomé. And he writes about her very lovingly, cared a lot about this person. And she inspired in him great thoughts and stuff in some of his great work. And after Nietzsche passes, she eventually found her way to Freud and had a relationship with Freud for a while.
Wow.
So yeah, these connections are pretty close.
Hmm.
And in a way, what you have with somebody like Freud is really just trying to make psychology a science, right? And trying to make it very
Yeah.
clearly like on scientific grounds. Whereas the 19th century, what counted as science was a little looser. And so you didn't have to deal with the same kind of like case studies and empirical analysis. It wasn't the same level of the same kind of standards. And so in a way, you can see that what Freud was doing is kind of trying to translate 19th century insights into a 20th century kind of scientific framework.
Mm.
So very similar. So if you ever want to dig into Freud and any existentialist, you'll find a lot of parallels.
Neat.
The difference is that a different kind of psychoanalysis did emerge out of existentialism. Sometimes it's called existential psychoanalysis.
Oh, right. Yeah.
I think like Dasein analysis is another one based more on Martin Heidegger. But the whole thing with a lot of depth psychology, like Freud and Jung, is to heal yourself in the moment. You have to go back to like early childhood problems, right? If I need to understand how to love a woman, I need to think about my relationship to my mom, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you're always going back to memory, to family, to the past to see how the events of the past have conditioned you and habituated you to certain things. And then if you can undo those knots of the past, you can be free in the present and live for the future. And then Jung says, well, there's even more than that. There's also these collective dimensions we have to look at. We have to look at the archetypes of our unconscious. And existentialism is like, no, you just, all this archaeology, all this digging
Yes.
doesn't need to happen. And ultimately, if you're going to choose to be healthy and free, you just have to make that choice now.
Mm.
Like Kierkegaard's leap of faith or whatever,
Mm-hmm.
this is just something you have to do irrationally. And so if you want to
Right.
love, you just choose to love. You don't go, oh, but my mother did this when
Yes.
I was 6 or 7 years old, and now I don't know if I can ever really love a woman.
Yes.
Who cares? I don't care what happened with you and your mom. And maybe it's conditioning you now, maybe it's not conditioning you now. All I know is whatever you want to do now is something you have to choose now. So existential psychoanalysis was much more about learning to decide for yourself authentically without reasons, without
Mm.
grounds.
Right. So, yeah, because Kierkegaard says decision is madness. And so it's kind of the madness of the now, you know, deciding to have a new narrative. Because I love the phrase you said, archaeology, because it's very much what psychoanalysis is or therapy. It becomes this archaeology of the psyche where you keep digging and you keep digging and you dig. And then you find, oh, it was, this traumatic moment. And that's why I'm this way. And it's like, okay, so what? And then what do? So now I know every little deep, dark secret about myself. And I know why I choose this and not this. And then what? You go to therapy and they teach you about yourself, but then they don't necessarily empower you or teach you how to make different choices in the future. Um, maybe because that means that you don't need them anymore, so they'd be out of a job. But yeah, so this beauty of the moment and deciding on spinning a new narrative. And so that reminds me of Hillman's concept of soul making. And so can you say anything about like soul making? Is there room for soul in existentialism, or is existentialism kind of like a place where there's no soul.
Right. I mean, it's among existentialists where you'd have people who have the courage to think without soul, right? So you would have some people who are like, hey, let's try and drop that word, drop that category. Can you think without it? Can you think about who you are without thinking of these old distinctions between body and soul? And so somebody like Martin Heidegger will actually just drop the concept of soul entirely and instead talk about like the openness of human existence.
Mm.
And so would somebody like Hillman call that soul making? Exactly, because he's doing that out of his own experience. So he's making his relationship to that part of our existence we call soul, but he's finding it for himself so that he can find a name for it for himself, right?
Oh,
You didn't know
right.
what soul was,
Right.
and you were looking in your life for what makes you who you are,
Right.
which is normally what we think of as soul. Soul is kind of like your identity as a person, it's your subjectivity, maybe it's your consciousness as it draws from the unconscious energies of your body, or uh, how would you define it if you didn't have that word? It might feel like this kind of open horizon within which your life unfolds. And so you kind of have that experimental language coming from some existentialists. But on the other hand, you have some that are happy to use the word soul, and it really is just a matter of trying to make it free. So,
Mm.
soul making in depth psychology is about drawing on things like memory and instinct and the unconscious. And you often hear Freud and Jung use a water metaphor. They talk about reclaiming land from the ocean, right? We want to make the unconscious conscious.
Mm-hmm.
And so we want to kind of like dredge and dig up earth out of the water, bring it onto dry land, and we can make our soul out of that, right? And existentialists, of course, if they're not doing this kind of archaeology, they're not doing the excavating, they're not trying to reclaim land from the sea. They're not trying to make the unconscious conscious.
Mm.
They're trying to really do away with those kind of projects and live totally freely. So if you're on the shore of a beach and you're looking out at the ocean, existentialists aren't trying to get land from the ocean. They're trying to just stay open in the moment, right? Instead of saying, hey, let's reclaim some of this land. We can build more. We can make more. They're
Mm.
like, no, just simply exist. Just simply be there
Mm-hmm.
and enjoy it. It's nice to be at the beach, right? Why are we always reclaiming land from the sea? Why do we not like the
Yeah.
unconscious and we're afraid of it as unconscious? We need to make the unconscious conscious. What you have from existentialism is more about letting beings be.
Mm.
And so
Mm.
you let the ocean be,
Mm.
let your past be, let your relationship with your mom be, let your relationship with the archetypes be. Like, who cares about whether something's an archetype? Maybe it's just a stereotype. You can live in the moment right now, and you don't have to adjust yourself according to these old symbols, according to memories or family dynamics. You can just simply be open, receptive, and accepting of things as they simply are.
Mm. So then, in that openness, what is there to do as a human? Like, because I feel like I really like the way you described the relationship between conscious and unconscious and the archaeology, connecting it to the archaeology of, you know, self in the world. Because the way you described it, it sounded like even psychology can become like a colonial project, the same as in on the earth, there's this land grab. And so it just reminded me of how instead of just looking at the unconscious and letting it be, there's this desire to colonize it and understand and dig and go in and change things, right?
Mhm.
So it's different. It's a little bit different. So if we're not colonizing and we're letting beings be, what does that world look like?
Right. Well, I mean, yeah, a few different things. I mean, Kafka, of course, right? To some extent, it means you're just caught in a meaningless world where everybody has to like wait in line for things and take a number and all that kind of stuff. So it could look like you're just in the nightmare of late modernity,
Mm.
right? Part of the assembly line technology, like everything else. And you can affirm it and accept it and kind of like laugh at the ridiculousness, enjoy the horror. People like horror movies, people like horror fiction, right? And so,
Right.
similarly to that, if you can really open up into that, you could just kind of learn to laugh at the absurdity of it. So you
Mm.
definitely have a lot of that from existential playwrights and novelists. So Kafka, but also Samuel Beckett, where a lot of people just being like, yeah, it's ridiculous. There's, and so in that sense, you're not necessarily resisting the norm. You're not like bringing justice to the world. You're just sitting there being like, wow, isn't everything terrible?
Mm.
And learning to be with that, but not necessarily changing it. And so it's easy to maybe criticize some existentialism for not being active enough in making the world that is more peaceful and just and sustainable, right? They're like, it's just ridiculous. On the other hand, you do have a strand of existentialists that thought when you start letting beings be, that means we should resist systems that are oppressing people.
Yeah,
And you see this especially with French
absolutely.
existentialists, Albert Camus, Jean-Paul Sartre, Simone de Beauvoir. They were all very active politically in
Yeah.
early 20th century liberation struggles. And like Sartre cared a lot about like the Haitian Revolution, right? He was really engaged with that. He goes, down to that area, hangs out with people, is trying to learn from those movements. So in that case, you have people who really cared about like socialist and communist senses of liberation, being anti-capitalist, anti-consumerist, and existentialism really having this kind of political edge,
Mm.
while also still just being about living a fun life, right? Not being political because you're an activist, being political because you're just trying to let beings be.
Mm.
And so the flip
Mm-hmm.
side of that was Sartre, Camus, and Beauvoir were like famous. And you can go to French airports now and you see pictures of them in the airport. You don't see pictures of philosophers in American
No,
airports.
you don't.
Something's different with these folks. And they were somehow like cool, like they knew how to party. And especially, I mean, if you ever see a picture of Camus, there's often like a cigarette, and
Right.
they're often drinking like coffee. And so just very kind of hip lifestyles, partying at night. And that's a different side of it than you have from people like Nietzsche and Kierkegaard, who are often full of despair, or Kafka, who's just
Mm.
awash in the dizzying absurdity of life. There's something really kind of exciting and fun about the French existentialists,
Mm.
yet still dark. They're still choosing that from nothing. They're not partying because partying is what normal people do.
Right. They're not
Partying
heard.
because they wake up and they make a choice to love life. They're not just going with the crowd. They know that going with the crowd means you might as well not be alive, right? Like for Camus, the
Mm.
basic question of all philosophy is why not just kill yourself,
Right.
right? If you're just going to accept things at second and third hand, and you're going to understand the meaning of your life based upon what other people are telling you, you might as well just kill yourself. If you're just going along with the crowd in any way, you don't exist. So just
Mm.
kill yourself.
Mm.
Every day you have to choose to be here. And so for him, he's like, so should I kill myself or just have a cup of coffee? And then every day he chose coffee, right? Like essentialists aren't like sad people. For somebody like him, he's a happy person, but a happy person who understands that happiness is a choice.
Mm.
Happiness is something you have to allow to happen. It can't just be something you accept at second or third hand. So it's a different way to kind of party and enjoy life. You're not doing it because other people are doing it.
Mm.
You're doing it because you really find joy deep down inside of you. And so, it's kind of like imagine if you knew you were going to die at the end of the day and you're drinking a cup of coffee and you go, wow, this is my last cup of coffee.
Mm.
You're watching the sunset at night and you go, wow, this is my last sunset. You can live with that awareness constantly. Every day can be the last sunset. And it means it has this absolutely singular preciousness. And you can inhabit that, this kind of sense of your constant mortality. You know you're going to die. I think
Mm.
especially in 2020, a lot of people are inhabiting that space a little more. We
Right.
know
Yeah.
we die at any moment, something could happen, and my life could be foreshortened far more than I could have ever imagined. And that can actually bring this kind of radiant glow to things. Wow, so this could be my last. And it has a different presence. Its existence is a little more stark, and you get
Mm-hmm.
to actually feel life. It's like we're in a car that has really good shocks and we don't feel the roughness of the road. And existentialism lets you really feel the road.
It takes
So
the
you don't,
shocks out, or
yeah,
the shock absorbers.
right. And so it doesn't, like in a car, that's obviously terrible and you're going to have a horrible ride. But for the human mind, for our experience, for our lives, if we don't feel the real
It's
world,
real. Yeah.
right, then why are we here? If we're just numbing ourselves, anesthetizing ourselves against reality, why
What are
even?
we doing?
All we're going to do if we're trying to numb ourselves to reality is we're going to hurt ourselves and we're going to drag down the rest of life on earth with us.
Which is what
That's
we're
what
doing
we do. Yeah, you have, as a response to environmental crisis, humans need to learn to accept that they're part of an environment. That means learning to feel the real world around us.
now. Hmm. The coldness. Instead of always changing our temperature, just feel the coldness and be cold. It's that simple.
Right, yeah. Just to be in general, whatever's happening, you can let it be.
Not trying to change
And
it.
not try to change it, not try to react against it, right? And to kind of drop the reactive side of life and be active, right? Be active, not reactive. And then you can kind of have a certain fearlessness to life. And you
Mm,
realize that the things that come and go, and you can still hold space for that, right? If your psyche is this kind of openness, this kind of horizon, then consciousness is like the sky, and storms don't hurt the sky.
mm,
So the more that you can accept who you really are, this kind of open existence, the more you can actively accept all the turmoil and chaos of your life. You can let the storms come and go. You can watch the weather change, even when that weather is bringing death and destruction. You
mm,
can still be part of the storm, participate in it, but it won't hurt you.
mm.
And then you have more space to help others.
Right. Right. Spaciousness. Yeah, absolutely. Because by practicing this way, and as you're talking, it sounds very spiritual. Kind of we're moving back into where we started, the religious dimension of the movement. Yeah, because when you're not changing, obsessively trying to change things, you give it a little bit more spaciousness. And in that spaciousness, you're kinder to yourself and you're kinder to others. So I'd like to move into how does existentialism connect with modern literature? How we've talked about religion and then psychology, and so now it is a literary movement. So maybe talk about the literature aspect of existentialism.
Right. Yeah. Because that's a really big part of it. Depending upon, where you learn it, you might think of existentialism primarily as literary. And then the philosophical side might seem kind of secondary. Camus, for instance, wrote philosophical works, but also wrote literature, wrote, novels and so. Likewise, Sartre wrote novels, wrote plays, but also wrote philosophy books. So even with the people who are doing straight philosophy, they're often doing it in a literary kind of way. Nietzsche is another good example, right? He's basically doing philosophy, or you could call it psychology, but his writing is mostly really lively metaphor. He's not trying to be like dry theoretical analysis. He's trying to really stretch the possibilities of language, and
Mm,
often using like short little paragraphs, what people would call aphorisms, kind of like proverbs, tweets, effectively,
mm,
right? These really small little passages that pack a punch, that have no context. He just kind of says a thing, and you're not sure if he's joking, if he's just trying to make fun of somebody, if he's trying to make a serious point, right? And you can kind of just go through all this text and make of it all kinds of different things, like a choose your own adventure novel.
mm,
And yet people read that in a philosophy class. They'll read that for psychology. They'll read that for literature. They'll read that in religion, right? He's kind of doing all these things. But the wild style of it all, the kind of like being bombastic, being a little confrontational, right? That's something you normally don't see in proper like scientific writings, sometimes more than others. But definitely Nietzsche brings that with everything he does. Kierkegaard's another good example. Kierkegaard's mostly like a religious writer and a philosopher, but he uses weird literary styles.
mm,
Mainly, like he writes in pseudonyms a lot. So he makes up names for himself, like Johannes de Silentio, which means like Silent John. And Silent John has all kinds of stuff to say about language and silence, and so somehow the character he's writing under a character. And so, like, is this what Kierkegaard thinks? Like, no, this isn't what Kierkegaard thinks. He's showing you what Silent John says, and
right.
Silent John might be an idiot. And here's how that idiot would think, right? And so, Silent John might represent like your average Christian living around Kierkegaard at the time, and he's saying, here's how those people are, And they sound right and they sound smart, but you can also see these problems in what they say. And so sometimes he'll have characters kind of arguing with each other. You know, he'll have this character says a thing, then this character does one. And it leaves you having to think for yourself about what's really true,
Mm.
right? Because you never get to say, okay, I agree with Kierkegaard because this is what Kierkegaard said. Like, oh, Kierkegaard never said what Kierkegaard says, right?
Right.
So the pseudonyms are a really playful way to make philosophy into literature. So like none of these people are respecting the boundary that says this is philosophy writing, this is literature writing.
Right.
Smash them together. And it's hard to tell when it's literary and when it's philosophical. It's hard to
Right.
tell when you're hearing Kierkegaard or Nietzsche's voice or when you're hearing a joke from them that they're trying to just make fun of or whatever. Um,
Well, it's interesting because what I find with philosophy, because it's so dominated by reason, you get so much debate. And then you're never going to back down and say when one person's right and one person's wrong, because the goal is to be right. But with literature, when you have these characters talking to one another, you identify with both of them. So then you get on both sides of the argument or four sides of the argument. And then you can see the multidimensional nature of arguments. So you can do philosophy but doing it kind of almost like safely through other characters. So is it kind of translating some of the philosophy of existentialism through like literary tactics?
yeah, because if part of the point of existentialism is not to just accept belief systems as they're handed down to you from other people, then you really risk having a belief system against belief system.
Right.
And so you're like, oh no, that was the whole point of what we were saying. And so it's ironic that there's even a movement called existentialism. Like, well, no, the whole point was we're not an ism. And
Right.
yeah, we noticed like 8 of you all said that. So we're going to call you the existentialists. And if you look, like Heidegger never used the phrase and didn't like it. Nietzsche
Right.
never used the phrase. Kierkegaard never uses the phrase. And so how do they get grouped under that? It's like, well, people got uneasy with their writing and had to group them together, you know?
Hmm.
There's some people who are like, hey, you can't label me. And it's like, yeah, okay, so we're going to call you the unlabelables.
Yeah,
Now you're
exactly.
still categorizable. Like, you can't put me in a box. Okay, we're going to have one box for all
You're
the
the
people that be able to fit in a box. And so there's this kind of constant need then to resist closure. There's a constant need to keep it open because the moment that it closes, it turns into a box. It
right.
turns into another ism. It turns into another belief system. And so, what are these kind of literary styles that can resist closure and maintain openness? And things like having characters and dialogue do that because you just can't pin down exactly what the right answer is. The movement of the characters is the right answer, right?
Yep.
There's the action of the characters, there's the context the characters are in, there's the specific things they do and that they say to each other in response to one another. And so you can never really nail down what was the point of this. Like, what's the point of Shakespeare's Hamlet? Like, there's a lot going on there. It's like a full expression of the drama of human existence. So
Right.
there's not like one simple point. And if there is a point, like it's about justice or something, right? It's like something's rotten in Denmark, and Hamlet feels like he needs to set it right. And there's still no sense of who the good guy is and the bad guy is and what makes a good guy good. Like the reason that we keep interpreting Shakespeare hundreds of years later is precisely he's able to keep those questions open,
Mm.
right? So we can
Right.
interpret them anew. Every generation can reread that material or see it, performed, and they can find a new approach to it. They can find a new relevance to their own life. And so because of that, anytime you see that kind of dynamic, somebody will say, in a way, Shakespeare was already existentialist hundreds of years ago. In
Oh,
a way,
interesting.
Plato was an existentialist by writing dialogues the way he did and affirming our participation in the mysteries of human life. So in that sense, existentialism is a literary style that can be found much broader than the specific movement that's 19th and 20th century.
Mm.
Style anybody can inhabit anywhere.
So then why do you think it got focused in that time period and became an ism?
Yeah, why such an eruption of it? I think it was because the need to affirm existence became much more urgent as the forces of modernization and industrialization were closing around everybody. It became a lot harder and harder to find room to breathe.
Mm.
Literally, air pollution was starting to become a serious problem because of
Mm.
people using coal, right? And as a source of energy. Right, early industrial revolution, coal was dominant way before oil and then natural gas. And coal's gross. That just ruins things.
Yeah.
So immediately people were dealing with kind of the really negative effects of living an industrial life. And that and modern alienation, just being in modern society where there was a kind of separation of religion from the public sphere, and that was able to live more free life for people, right? The French Revolution, the American Revolution, and all of a sudden people are like, let's be free people. Like, well, yeah, but that means that like now we have to decide for ourselves, and now we're all arguing amongst each other.
Mm-hmm.
A long time ago, everybody knew what their place was in the cosmic order. And it was also a terrible place. You were a slave or a serf or whatever, but you knew your
But you
place.
knew.
And so there was a sort of sense where you didn't have a choice to affirm your own individual existence. But now that your own individual existence was exposed to freedom, it was harder for people to know what to make of life. They
Mm,
couldn't define their lives by the old systems. We gave up on the old systems.
right.
And so we had to start inventing something new.
It reminds me of one of my favorite bands, Bright Eyes. They have a phrase that says, "Too many options will kill a man." And that always stuck with me because, you know, we're raised with all this choice and like people say that's paradise, right? You're living in paradise. But at some point you're just, I'm bombarded. It becomes a burden in and of itself.
Yeah. And obviously, it's like a good burden to have
Right.
compared to the burden of like being, a slave in like I don't know, working for a pharaoh in ancient Egypt or whatever.
Right.
And so, there's always a burden to life, and then you have this burden of not having burdens in a way, the burden of freedom,
Mm-hmm.
the burden
Right.
of free choice. And then what do you do with that? And it turns out we have resources for thinking about it, and there are things like Shakespeare or Plato or Jesus, right? But all that stuff had gotten covered over with so many
Right.
interpretations, different institutions, and everything got kind of put in a box. The
Mm-hmm.
openness and the kind of experimental passion of all that stuff got lost. And so the existentialists kind of made that stuff readable again.
Mm.
So in a way, when you see Nietzsche talking about the death of God, he's trying to just return us to ancient pagan love of nature.
Mm.
Nothing different than that. He's just making that stuff livable for the 19th and 20th century. Kierkegaard's just trying to make the message of Jesus livable again.
Mm.
So it's not just about going to church. It's not just about your belief systems. It's about
Right.
a real passion for God and passion for peace and justice and
Right.
goodness, beauty of the world, right? And so how do we kind of keep these old ways livable? Means keeping them open. And there was a variety of people trying to do that, right? Romantics were trying to do that at the same time as existentialists, but they weren't trying to keep it open. They were trying to go back. They were like, let's go back to pagan times. And Nietzsche's like, you can't go back. We have to invent it for ourselves right now.
Right. There's no
Right?
going back.
And it's going to look different if we have to reinvent it right now. It's not going to look like me saying, hey, paganism sure was great. It's going to be me inventing a new paganism by connecting to animals, right? When Nietzsche writes with a character named Zarathustra, Zarathustra's best friends are an eagle and a snake,
Oh, cool.
right? He doesn't write a book saying how ancient people used to worship snakes. He writes a new character that has a new relationship to a different snake, right? Eagle and
Hmm.
his snake, the sky and the earth, right? So it's a new way to relate to heaven and earth. It's coming out of his imagination in the moment.
Mm.
So instead of just trying to worship the past or return to the past with a kind of nostalgia the way romantics did, what made the existentialists unique was that they were trying to live it for themselves in the present.
So
Uh,
making new stories instead of trying to keep reinterpreting old stories,
right.
just making a new story
And
with
that
similar
like
characters.
who are all these new people who keep talking about their existence? And so they got called existentialists.
Hmm.
Because the common thread was them trying to say that all the meanings and institutions and ideas and interpretations, all that stuff of society has covered up like the core of our lives. And the old word for that is something like life or existence, maybe
Oh,
being, right? But there's this thing that we're always interpreting, and we want to get back to that. less interpretation, more life.
More
Less
that.
ideas about life, more experiences of life.
But then when you have so many ideas, it's almost impossible to get beyond those ideas and get back to life itself.
Right.
Especially in modern civilization when there's so many layers of things and distractions. I could talk to you about this forever. But I do want to start closing up. And so you've kind of talked around this topic just now. But I want to ask, where is existentialism right now in our current moment? And, you mentioned this phrase that, they couldn't breathe. I mean, that is so relevant to our current moment, not only with, we're here with wildfires in California, but I can't breathe. We're dealing with systemic racism here. So, and with the pandemic, you got coronavirus and it's a lung thing. So I just couldn't help but notice that. So maybe you could kind of talk about that and how, like, where is existentialism right now? Is it still around?
Yeah, it's always taught in colleges. It is a good example of its staying power. There's always like an existentialism 101 kind of class in like philosophy departments. And you don't always see that with every single movement in the history of philosophy. Not everything has that kind of staying power. Not everything always enrolls. So one of the ways that existentialism persists is that everybody goes through a point in their life where they have to decide if they want to think for themselves or go with the crowd.
Mm-hmm.
That's the existentialist moment in all of our lives. And when you say, no, I want to learn to think for myself and not take things at second and third hand, then existentialism is going to be relevant. And you're going to find a lot of energy and inspiration from reading those people, because it turned out they went through it too. At a time when society did not like that. Right now, it's a little more
Right.
courageous to try and like make yourself and go your own way. They were some of the first people to really carve that out. In a way that makes sense in the modern society. So that's one of the ways. So anybody, especially when you're somewhere between like 15 and 30 years old, that's really when you start being like, wait a second, I can question my conditioning. I can question authority. I can learn to think for myself. So that's always going to be there. But there's something else happening. I mean, like you're saying, with, I Can't Breathe, with Black Lives Matter, the fact that coronavirus is a respiratory pandemic. So obviously there's a shortage of breath in a new way right now. And that's opening up a new horizon for existentialism because we're all going through it together. And what
Oh,
happened, what was really unique about people like Kierkegaard and Nietzsche is they precisely were not going through it together. They felt really alone in a society that looked meaningless. And they found a way to make meaning for themselves, right? To make a soul in a soulless
mm-hmm.
world. And they
Mm-hmm.
did that with like no support.
They're the
Support
sacrificial lambs.
in a way, right? So you could say that Nietzsche and Kierkegaard are like the sacrificial lambs of existentialism, and that their loneliness is something that we don't have to go through anymore, precisely because now we have them, right? And so that's only
It's very
increased,
Jesus-like.
right? And I mean, that's what they were ultimately trying to live, right? Whether that's in the name of Christ for Kierkegaard or as the reverse antichrist for Nietzsche. Nietzsche saw the only way to live out the Christian message was to flip it, right? Because ultimately, wasn't Jesus supposed to be about the earth? And it was only the
Revolutionary.
institutions and the history that turned it into heaven so much. But Jesus cared about the poor, he cared about our bodies, he cared about those most vulnerable among us. So how to make that livable again. And then throughout the 20th century, more and more people start to participate in it. And you start to see, a more global movement. I mean, already it was pretty widespread with Dostoevsky in Russia, right? But you start to see like Mexican existentialism with Jose Ortega y Gasset. You start to see Black existentialism with Frantz Fanon. So you start to see a lot more happening. More feminist stuff comes out of it after Simone de Beauvoir.
Mm-hmm.
And so more and more voices are joining in saying, let's affirm life and let's build something that can keep us open and free, right? So that we can let all beings be. And increasingly, that's also included environmental concerns,
Mm,
because the biggest existential threat to humanity right now is an uninhabitable earth.
yeah.
And in the 19th century, the loss of wilderness was like a problem, but not the loss of like breathable air, not the loss
Mm,
of arable land, not the loss of fresh water. And so now, because of pollution, because of extinction, climate change, a variety of other issues, the existential threat to human life is no longer our individual mortality. It's now our collective mortality that
hmm.
we share with the rest of the
With
biosphere.
other, yeah,
And so you have some people now talking about like ecological existentialism. It's the
like
same thing
yourself.
about affirming existence, except it's not just about affirming my existence as an individual. I'm an individual for sure, but I'm an individual that's intimately intertwined with all the rest of life on Earth. And so we can affirm that existence is always already coexistence, that to be a thing at all is to be intimately interconnected with everything else. So affirming my life and death means affirming my ways of living and dying with others.
Mm,
So how to live well and die well in a world teeming with life and death.
mm,
So it's a good news, bad news thing. The bad news is obviously that we're facing greater threats than ever before as a human species. But the good news is we're finding that there's a solidarity that we already have by virtue of the fact that we all exist together. Sometimes people think that we need to build some great solidarity between all humans.
hmm.
This kind of ecological existentialism saying, no, it's actually already there
Mm,
by virtue of the fact that we already exist. The solidarity is already there. We don't need to make it or build it or like I don't know, invent it. We need to discover it,
mm,
right? We need to uncover something that's already there, the
right.
basic condition of our existence. We need to kind of question some of the meanings we've inherited and the ideas we've inherited and slough that stuff off and just simply be. And when you just simply be, you'll find that you are with others. And
Mm,
even, like the little plants behind me right now,
hmm.
right? That are taking in carbon dioxide and they're emitting oxygen. I'm breathing oxygen, I'm emitting carbon dioxide. We're
Mm,
intimately connected with each other
hmm.
and sit in that and experience it at all times. And then you're just participating in this ongoing miracle of the simple fact that you exist. Like, why is there anything at all? Why isn't it just nothing?
Right. That's very
Might be
existential.
no good reason for that, and there doesn't need to be. The fact that it exists is its own reason.
That's enough. Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think we'll end on that note. That's a wonderful note to end on. So, again, thank you so much for being here and for sharing your wisdom and knowledge. And yeah, thank you so much.
Thanks. It's a pleasure.
All right. Everybody, have a great morning, afternoon, evening. Take care.